So here we are at Bible Hub looking at Deuteronomy 20:17. Here are the various translations. Completely destroy them, the Hittites, the Amorites, etc. You must completely destroy. You shall devote them completely to destruction. And utterly destroy, we have in many of these versions, utterly destroy them, and so forth. It looks like it's either utterly or completely. Um, You must claim, this is God's word, this is kind of a paraphrase. You must claim them and completely destroy them, and so forth. Um, but shalt kill them with the edge of the sword, to wit, and so forth. Utterly devote them to destruction. Mm-hmm. So if you look at the translation, interestingly, these two Hebrew words, the one is an infinitive absolute, to seclude, to devote to religious uses, to be blunt as to the nose, to seclude, to devote to religious uses, to be blunt as to the nose. These two different words, um, the one intensifies the other. In other words, completely destroy. But the word doesn't just mean destroy, it can also mean to devote to religious uses, which is really interesting. And I was hoping I could find a commentary on that here at Bible Hub, but there is none. Now, I think this is a problem because if you look in the very next verse, after the Israelites are told to completely destroy or to devote thoroughly to God the inhabitants of the promised land, the very next verse says, when you besiege a city for many days to wage war against it, to capture it, you shall not destroy its trees by wielding an axe against them. For you may eat from them, but you shall not cut them down. Is the tree of the field a man to go into the siege before you? Now, I'm making the case, of course, for the Christian faith through these videos. And we've talked in the past about the conquest of Canaan. But you've got to keep something in perspective. Most normal people, even most Christians who typically don't read the Bible, when they would see something like this, they would be shocked and horrified that the Jews are being told to go in and utterly destroy the inhabitants of this country that they are invading. I mean, we feel ashamed here in the USA that we destroyed almost utterly the Native Americans who came before us when we invaded North America and South America, for that matter. So, what are normal people to think when they read this? And then the very next verse says, right after they're told, completely wipe out the people who are there before you, but don't cut the trees down. The trees aren't fighting against you. Now, I know it's tempting to say, oh, well, they don't understand, because after all, I mean, I've tried to explain to you the context of the conquest of Canaan, but you've also got to be aware that other people you will come in contact with in the world when you grow up and are in a position where you might be called upon to defend your faith, they have consciences. In fact, we read in Sirach, then to heed your own heart's counsel, for there is nothing you can depend on more. The heart can reveal your situation better than 7 sentinels on a tower. Then, with all this, pray to God to make your steps firm in the true path. Sirach, Ecclesiasticus, is telling us what the church tells us. The voice of our conscience is ultimately paramount. Now, it should be understood that our consciences ought to be properly formed. But when you're out in the world dealing with normal people who they're not going to know Deuteronomy 20. But if they stumble upon it, or if they hear from their friends, or probably from the internet, that the God of the Old Testament is bloodthirsty and demands the utter destruction of the pagans when the Jews invade the Promised Land, if you hear that, you've got to understand, you can answer with what you know, which is it was because of the abominable practices of the Canaanites that God was asking them to be wiped out. You could also say, well, the word that's used for utterly destroy also means completely dedicate to God, although they would answer that's a pretty strange way to completely dedicate someone to God. And they're going to be thinking, religious fanatic. They're going to be thinking Islamic extremists uh, flying planes into the World Trade Center and the Pentagon and so forth. And you've got to understand where they're coming from, because that's sure what it looks like. When you go from kill everybody to leave the trees alone, that's shocking and disturbing to any normal human being, because their conscience, the counsels of their heart, are going to tell them that's unacceptable. Now, interestingly, their consciences would not tell them that had we not for the past 2,000 years been living in a Christian civilization where Jesus says, love your enemies, do good to them who hurt you, which seems to contradict what God is telling the Israelites through Moses in Deuteronomy 20. But of course, I'm hoping we know what that means. One of the things I think that's happening is people can only take in what they can take in. The Jews are living in an ancient time where warfare, on the one hand, they get the Ten Commandments, thou shalt not kill, but that only applies to them and their group. And it only applies when it's not a capital offense. They're told to kill one another for disobeying the commandments, so that you stone a woman taken in adultery. By the way, if you notice, it takes 2 or 3 witnesses to condemn someone in the Mosaic Law, which we've been reading about in Deuteronomy in particular, and then in the Gospels today, the Sanhedrin, the Jewish court, is looking for 2 or 3 witnesses to condemn Jesus Christ, because they couldn't condemn him by their own Mosaic Law without 2 or 3 witnesses. They finally get 2 witnesses to agree to perjure themselves and claim that Jesus said he would destroy the temple and raise it up again, though he was talking about his own body, we're told elsewhere. Now, so we see how the law fits together. We've talked about how the law is a kind of tutor, as St. Paul says, leading us to a place where we can be mastery of what the law implies. But we are able to take in what we can take in. That was true of the Jews in ancient times, so that they perhaps the Mosaic Law was meant for them for what they could take in at the time. But it's true for people now. You're not going to be able to expect even your other Catholic friends, who of course are completely scripturally illiterate, if they catch wind, especially from the internet, of somebody saying, well, God is telling them to kill everybody and save the trees, all you could pretty much say is, yeah, that sounds awful, doesn't it? I agree. And if that's all our God is, if that's all we had to go on, we shouldn't believe in that God, because our consciences witness against that. But when you put it in context, you see that the Bible is a whole story, and that this moment in the history of salvation is fulfilled by Christ, who says, love your enemies and do good to those who hurt you. Christ, who withers the fig tree, because clearly a human being is more important than a tree. But what they're saying in context in Deuteronomy is, if you destroy fruit-bearing trees, you're doing a permanent harm to the land itself. God is not taking a stand against the land, he's taking a stand against the Canaanites, who are murdering their children and not repenting of it. But again, you've got to understand how people's consciences will make them feel a certain way, and you can't argue against that. You can argue against their knowledge and the context, but that's a difficult case to make, because you guys don't know this until you start studying this. How are other people who aren't reading Deuteronomy? Nobody sits down to read Deuteronomy. Nobody. You're doing it because I'm making you, students. But you're seeing one of the reasons why so many atheists and secularists and even Catholics and Protestants will take a firm stand against God. And again, if this is all that God is, they're right. But this is not all that God is. Anyway, I just wanted to make sure you understood that, especially as you go out into the world outside the homeschooled super Catholic bubble that you're in, that people will respond the way you would think people would respond to something like this. More tomorrow.